I was 16 the Christmas I learned just how dark the world could be. It was 1989, the kind of December that chilled you to the core even when the sun was out. We were living in a no-name town in northern Michigan, a place so small it didn't even have a McDonald's. My mom called it quaint, my dad called it a black hole. We'd moved there that summer after Dad lost his job at the plant. Mom thought a fresh start would fix things. She painted the new house yellow, baked cookies every Sunday, and tried to make it feel like home. But you can't paint over disappointment, and no amount of sugar can mask the bitter taste of failure. By Christmas, the cracks were showing. Dad drank too much. Mom cried when she thought no one was looking. And I spent most of my time outside, walking the endless back roads where the silence was a little less oppressive. The night it happened, I was at the gas station on Route 9, the one that sold stale donuts and cans of soda past their expiration dates. It was Christmas Eve, and I was supposed to pick up a gallon of milk for Mom. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed like angry wasps, and the cashier, a guy named Denny who looked like he hadn't slept in a week, barely glanced up as I grabbed the milk. "Busy night?" I asked, just to fill the silence. Denny snorted. "You're the first customer I've had in 2 hours. Whole town's probably at church or home watching It's a Wonderful Life." I paid, said thanks, and stepped back out into the cold. That's when I saw the car. It was an old Buick, dark blue with rust, eating away at the wheel wells. It was parked at the edge of the lot, its engine idling, exhaust billowing in the frigid air. Something about it felt wrong. The driver's window was cracked, and I could see a man inside, his face shadowed by the brim of a baseball cap. He was staring straight ahead, hands gripping the steering wheel like he was waiting for something or someone. I didn't think much of it at first. This was the kind of town where people left their doors unlocked and waved at strangers. But as I walked past the Buick, the man turned his head and looked at me. Really looked at me. His eyes were dark, almost black, and his face was pale, thin, like he hadn't eaten in days. For a second, I thought he might say something, but he just stared, unblinking. I quickened my pace, my boots crunching in the snow, and didn't look back until I was halfway down the block. When I finally glanced over my shoulder, the Buick was gone. The house was dark when I got home. Mom and Dad had gone to the midnight service, leaving me a note on the kitchen counter. "Milk for Santa cookies is in the fridge. Be good and don't stay up too late. Merry Christmas, honey. Love, Mom." I put the milk away and turned on the TV, flipping through static-filled channels until I landed on some cheesy holiday special. That's when I heard the knock. It was soft at first, barely louder than the hum of the TV. I froze, the remote slipping from my hand. Then it came again, louder this time. Knock. Knock. I glanced at the clock. 11:47 p.m., Mom? Dad? I called, though I knew it couldn't be them. The knock came again, more insistent. Knock. 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 I stood, my heart pounding, and moved to the window. Pulling the curtain back just an inch, I peered outside. The porch was empty. I told myself it was the wind, maybe a tree branch scraping against the house. But deep down, I knew better. The knock came a fourth time, followed by a voice. "Hello. I need help." It was a man's voice, low and steady, but there was something off about it, like he was trying too hard to sound normal. I crept to the door, my feet silent on the hardwood, and pressed my eye to the peephole. It was him, the man from the Buick. He wasn't wearing his hat anymore, and his face was clearer now. His cheeks were sunken, his lips cracked and pale. He looked wrong, like a puppet that had been put together with parts that didn't quite fit. "Please," he said, his voice softer now. "It's so cold out here. I just need to use the phone." Every nerve in my body screamed at me to stay quiet, to wait him out. But then he said something that made my blood run cold. "I saw you at the gas station." My breath caught. "I know you're in there," he said. "Come on. Be a good kid. It's Christmas after all." I backed away from the door, my hands shaking. My first thought was to call the police, but the phone was in the kitchen, right next to the window that faced the porch. The man knocked again, harder this time. "You're not very nice, are you?" he said, his voice taking on a sing-song quality. "Not very nice at all." I grabbed a knife from the counter and darted into the pantry, closing the door as quietly as I could. For a moment, there was silence. Then I heard the doorknob rattle. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. The sound of splintering wood filled the air, followed by heavy footsteps. "Where are you, kid?" he called. I pressed myself against the wall, the knife clutched tightly in my hand. "I just want to talk," he said. "Promise." His footsteps moved through the house, slow and deliberate. Then they stopped. "I see you." The pantry door swung open, and there he was, his face inches from mine. I screamed and lashed out with the knife, catching him across the arm. He yelped and stumbled back, clutching the wound. "Little bastard," he hissed. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I bolted past him, my socked feet slipping on the floor, and ran for the back door. He was close behind me, his breath hot on my neck. I threw the door open and plunged into the snow, my legs burning as I sprinted toward the woods. I don't know how long I ran. Long enough for the cold to seep into my skin, for my lungs to ache with every breath. Eventually, I collapsed behind a fallen tree, my body trembling. I listened, straining to hear his footsteps, his voice. But there was nothing. Just the wind, howling through the trees. The police found me the next morning, shivering and half-conscious. The man was never caught. Sometimes I think about him, about the way his eyes bore into mine that night. And every Christmas, when the snow starts to fall, I lock the doors and double-check the windows, because I know he's still out there, waiting. Every town has its Christmas traditions. In Maple Hollow, it was the carolers. Not the kind you'd find in most places, kids with rosy cheeks and matching scarves, or a church choir that'd shuffle door to door with hymnals in hand. No, the carolers in Maple Hollow were different. They come after dark. My grandmother used to whisper, her voice trembling. If they stop at your door, don't listen. Don't let them in. And whatever you do, don't sing along. As a kid, I thought she was just trying to scare me. Old folks love their weird superstitions, and my grandma was no exception. But as I got older, I started noticing things. How the streets would empty out early on Christmas Eve. How people would draw their curtains tight and leave their porch lights off, even when the snow made everything look like a Hallmark postcard. And then there was the song. It was faint, carried on the wind, like a melody you couldn't quite place, but still felt deep in your chest. I heard it for the first time when I was 10, lying in bed while my parents hosted their annual holiday party. The adults were downstairs, laughing and clinking glasses when the singing started. It wasn't cheerful, like Jingle Bells or Deck the Halls. It was slow, haunting, the kind of tune that made your skin crawl. The voices were layered too many to count and perfectly in sync, like they were part of some ancient, forgotten ritual. I crept to the window and peeked through the curtains. The street was empty, except for a fresh blanket of snow. But the song continued, growing louder, closer. "Go to bed, Joey," my mom said when she caught me. Her voice was sharp, her smile tight. "And don't look outside again." I didn't hear the carolers again for years, not until I moved back to Maple Hollow after college. The town hadn't changed much, same old diner on Main Street, same wreaths hung from the lampposts every December. But the vibe was different, heavier somehow, like the place was holding its breath. I moved into my grandma's house after she passed. It was a creaky old Victorian on the edge of town, the kind of house where the floorboards groan even when no one was walking on them. The first Christmas back, I decided to host a party, just like my parents used to. I figured it'd be a good way to reconnect with people I hadn't seen in years. By PM, the party was in full swing. We had eggnog, a roaring fire, and someone had queued up a Spotify playlist of holiday classics. It felt normal, almost cozy, until the power went out. "Oh, come on," I groaned, fumbling for my phone. "Sorry, guys. The wiring in this place is ancient." "I'll grab some candles." The room fell into an uneasy silence as the guests huddled together in the dark. That's when we heard the singing. It started soft, just a whisper of a melody, but it was unmistakable. The room went still, and someone let out a nervous laugh. "Is that carolers?" my friend Lisa asked. "No one does that anymore," said Mike, who'd been chugging eggnog like it was water. "Do they?" The singing grew louder, and I felt the hair on my arms stand on end. I walked to the window, my heart hammering. "Don't," Lisa said, grabbing my arm. But I had to look. I pulled the curtain back just an inch, and there they were, 5 figures standing in the snow. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, like something out of a Dickens novel, and their faces were pale, almost translucent. Their mouths moved in perfect unison, but their eyes were fixed on me. I stumbled back, letting the curtain fall. "What the hell was that?" "They're here," Lisa whispered. Her face was pale, her voice trembling. "Close the curtains. Turn off the music. Don't let them in. What are you talking about?" I asked, but she didn't answer. She just started snuffing out the candles, her movements frantic. The singing was louder now, and it felt like it was coming from inside my head. "Don't listen," Lisa said. "Just block it out." The rest of the partygoers were panicking, whispering among themselves or staring at the windows like they were waiting for something to burst through. And then the knocking started. It was soft at first, almost polite. Then it grew insistent, rattling the door on its hinges. "Joey," a voice called from outside. It was sweet, lilting, and so familiar it made my chest ache. "Joey, let us in. It's cold out here." My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the door. "No," Lisa screamed, grabbing me by the shoulders. "It's not real. Don't let them in." But I wasn't listening. The voice, it sounded like my grandmother. I unlocked the door, and everything happened at once. Lisa shoved me aside, slamming the door shut just as I opened it a crack. But it was too late. The singing swelled, deafening, and the room was plunged into chaos. People screamed, clawing at their ears, and I swear I saw shadows darting across the walls, their shapes twisting and unnatural. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The power came back on, and the room was empty. I never saw Lisa again after that night. The police found her car abandoned on the edge of town, the driver's door wide open, but no trace of her. The other guests, they don't talk about it. When I run into them at the grocery store or the gas station, they look at me like I'm a ghost. Every Christmas since, I've heard the song. It starts faint, just a whisper on the wind, and I know one day they'll come back. I used to think the worst thing about Christmas was the crowds at the mall. All those sweaty, desperate people scrambling for deals like rats in a garbage heap. But that was before the Christmas Eve spent at Rikers Hollow. That night changed everything. I was 19, home from college, and full of that cocky kind of invincibility only young men can muster. My older brother, Dean, was my polar opposite, steady, responsible, already married with a kid on the way. He'd invited me to spend Christmas Eve with him and his wife, Sarah, at their new place. We're just outside Rikers Hollow, he'd said over the phone. You'll love it. Quiet, plenty of space. Bring your boots, the snow's supposed to get deep. Rikers Hollow was a tiny hamlet buried in the hills of western Maine. If you blinked, you'd miss it. A handful of clapboard houses, a gas station that doubled as a grocery store, and a church whose steeple leaned precariously to one side. Dean's house was a rental on the outskirts of town, surrounded by woods so thick you couldn't see the sky. The snow started falling just as I pulled into their driveway. Big, wet flakes that clung to the windshield and muffled the sound of my tires on the gravel. Sarah greeted me at the door with a warm smile and a plate of cookies, but I could tell something was off. Dean wasn't there. He went into town to grab some last-minute groceries, Sarah said, brushing a strand of blonde hair from her face. Shouldn't be long. I didn't think much of it at the time. Dean was dependable to a fault, and Rikers Hollow wasn't exactly a hotbed of criminal activity. But as the hours ticked by, my unease grew. By PM, the snow was coming down in earnest, a relentless wall of white that swallowed everything. The house creaked under the weight of the wind, and the power flickered ominously. Sarah tried calling Dean, but his phone went straight to voicemail. Maybe he got stuck, I said, though I didn't believe it. Dean was careful, the kind of guy who carried chains in the trunk and checked the weather twice before leaving the house. We waited another hour before deciding to go look for him. Sarah stayed behind. She was 7 months pregnant and couldn't risk slipping on the ice. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of growing dread, I set out into the storm. The road into town was a narrow, winding strip of asphalt that cut through the woods like a scar. In the daylight, it was picturesque. At night, it was a corridor of shadows. The snow was knee-deep in places, and the trees loomed overhead like sentinels. I found Dean's car about a mile from the house. It was half buried in a snowbank, the driver's side door hanging open. "Dean," I called, my voice swallowed by the storm. The only response was the wind. I shone my flashlight inside the car. The keys were still in the ignition, and his jacket was draped over the passenger seat. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, just a faint set of footprints leading away from the car and into the woods. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The tracks were uneven, as if Dean had been stumbling, and they led me deeper into the forest. The snow muffled everything, turning the world into a silent, monochrome void. That's when I started hearing it. A faint jingling, like sleigh bells, carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Then it grew louder, a rhythmic, metallic clatter that seemed to come from all around me. "Dean," I shouted, my breath fogging in the icy air. The bells stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing. Then, from somewhere ahead, came a low, guttural laugh. It wasn't human. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The laugh came again, closer this time, followed by the crunch of snow. Something was moving toward me. I turned and ran. I don't remember much of the trip back to the house. The snow blurred everything, and my legs felt like lead. By the time I reached the porch, I was gasping for air, my lungs burning. Sarah met me at the door, her eyes wide with fear. "Where's Dean?" she asked. "He's gone," I said, barely able to speak. Something took him. We barricaded ourselves inside, piling furniture against the doors and windows. The power went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. We sat by the fireplace, the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. That's when we heard the bells. They started faint, almost imperceptible, and then grew louder, circling the house. Sarah clutched her belly, her knuckles white. "It's him," she whispered. "He's come back," but I knew better. Whatever was out there, it wasn't Dean. A shadow passed by the window, tall and hunched, with antlers that scraped the eaves. The bells jingled again, and the doorknob rattled violently. "Don't let it in," I said, my voice barely audible. The rattling stopped, replaced by a voice. "Let me in, Sarah," it said, low and gravelly. It sounded like Dean. Sarah started to rise, but I grabbed her arm. "It's not him," I hissed. The thing outside laughed, a hollow, mocking sound. Then it began to sing. "Silent night. Holy night." The melody was warped, the notes bending and cracking like ice. It sang for hours, until the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. Then, as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. They found Dean's body 2 days later, frozen solid in the woods. His face was twisted in a rictus of terror, and around his neck was a string of bells tied with a crimson ribbon. Sarah moved away after that, taking the baby with her. She doesn't talk about that night, and neither do I. But every Christmas Eve, I hear the bells, and I know it's still out there, waiting. Christmas was different when I was a kid. It wasn't all Target gift cards and Amazon Prime deliveries. Back then, it felt like magic, or at least it did to me. Growing up in Winter Hollow, a tiny speck of a town in New Hampshire, the snow came early and stayed late. By December, the world was blanketed in white, and the pines looked like something out of a Christmas card. Our town had a tradition, too. Every year, on December 22nd, we'd have the Festival of the Stag. It was a big deal: parades, bonfires, and this old carved wooden deer statue that wheeled into the town square. The story went that centuries ago, a great white stag saved the settlers of Winter Hollow from starvation. It led them through a blizzard to a hidden valley teeming with game. They killed the stag, of course, because people are like that, but afterward, they realized it wasn't an ordinary animal. They said its blood ran like molten silver, and when they butchered it, its heart didn't stop beating until the next dawn. In return for its sacrifice, the stag gave the town a gift, or maybe it was a curse. Every Christmas, they'd leave offerings at the statue's hooves: bread, meat, wine. If the offerings were accepted, the town would have a mild winter, no sickness, no bad harvests. But if the stag was displeased, well, people whispered about what happened then, but no one ever talked too loud. I didn't believe in the stag when I was a kid. It was just a story, like Santa or the Tooth Fairy. But that changed the year my brother disappeared. Tommy was 9 that Christmas. I was 12. He was the kind of kid who always had dirt on his face and holes in his jeans, no matter how new they were. He followed me everywhere, which was annoying, but I loved him anyway. That year, our parents were fighting a lot. Dad had been laid off from the mill, and Mom was picking up extra shifts at the diner. Money was tight, but they still tried to make Christmas special for us. On December 21st, there was a snowstorm, one of those freak blizzards that seems to come out of nowhere. The wind howled all night, and by morning, the drifts were so high you could barely see the tops of the picket fences. Tommy was up early, begging me to go sledding with him. I didn't want to. I was at that age where everything my little brother did embarrassed me, but he wouldn't shut up about it, So I gave in. We bundled up in layers of mismatched winter clothes and grabbed the sled. The hill behind the old church was the best spot, steep and smooth. By the time we got there, the sky was a flat, dull gray, and the air felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath. "Bet I can beat you to the bottom," Tommy shouted, already halfway up the hill. "Sure, buddy," I said, rolling my eyes. He hopped on the sled and pushed off, laughing as he sped down the slope. I followed, slower, savoring the quiet. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a flash of white against the dark tree line. But then it moved graceful, deliberate. It was a deer, or at least it looked like one. Its fur was pure white, and its antlers stretched wide and twisted, like the branches of an ancient tree. It stood at the edge of the woods, watching us. "Tommy," I called, my voice tight. "Get back here," but Tommy didn't listen. He never did. He was already halfway to the tree line, trudging through the snow. "Did you see it?" he yelled. "It's the stag. It's real." "No," I said, running after him. "It's not real. Come back." He turned to look at me, grinning, and that's when the stag bolted. It moved like a shadow, silent and impossibly fast, disappearing into the woods. Tommy followed. I searched for him for hours. I screamed his name until my throat was raw, but the only answer was the wind. When I stumbled back into town, frostbitten and hysterical, my parents were waiting on the porch. I told them what had happened, how Tommy had run into the woods after the stag, but they didn't believe me. "Enough with the stories, Joey," my dad said, his voice shaking. "Where is your brother?" "I don't know." I cried. "I told you, he just disappeared." The search party went out that night. Half the town combed the woods, their flashlights cutting through the dark like tiny lighthouses. They didn't find anything. No footprints, no broken branches. It was like Tommy had vanished into thin air. The next day, the festival of the stag went on as usual. I didn't understand it at first. How could they go through with the festival when Tommy was still missing? But then I noticed something. People wouldn't look at me. They wouldn't look at my parents either. It was like we'd become ghosts, something to be avoided. That night, I snuck out to the square. The bonfire was roaring, casting flickering shadows on the snow, and the wooden stag stood in its usual spot, its carved eyes staring into eternity. I watched as the townsfolk laid their offerings at its feet: loaves of bread, bottles of wine, a roasted goose. The mayor stepped forward, holding a silver bowl filled with something dark and wet. "Great stag," he said, his voice trembling. "Accept our offerings. Protect us through the winter." He poured the contents of the bowl onto the snow. It steamed in the cold air, staining the ground red. Blood. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Christmas Eve, my parents packed up the car and left town. We didn't even stop to say goodbye. We never talked about it, not even years later, when I was old enough to piece things together. Tommy wasn't the first to go missing. Every few years, a child would disappear near Christmas, always under strange circumstances. And every time, the festival went on like nothing had happened. I think they knew. I think they all knew. It's been 20 years since that Christmas. I haven't been back to Winter Hollow since, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the wind howling outside my window, and I swear I can hear the faint sound of hooves on the snow. And every Christmas Eve, I dream of the stag. Its eyes are black and endless, and its antlers stretch across the sky like the roots of some terrible ancient tree. It doesn't speak, but I can feel its words in my bones. What was taken will not be returned, and I know it's still waiting. The snowstorm that hit Cranberry Falls on December 23rd wasn't your typical New England blizzard. Sure, we're used to heavy snow this time of year, but this was different. The flakes fell thick and fast, the wind howled like a living thing, and the sky turned a strange, bruised shade of purple that made everything look wrong, like the world had been flipped inside out. I remember it vividly, because that was the night the visitor came. Cranberry Falls is a quiet place, just a cluster of houses, a diner, a gas station, and an old church that creaks in the winter wind. The kind of town where everyone knows everyone, and gossip spreads faster than the flu. My family, me, my wife Julie, and our 6-year-old daughter Emily moved here from Boston 3 years ago, looking for a simpler life. We didn't get out much, but we didn't mind. Life was slow, predictable, until that night. It started around p.m. The storm had knocked out the power, so we were huddled in the living room by the fireplace, trying to make the best of it. Emily was coloring in her little sketch pad, and Julie and I were sipping hot cocoa, the kind that comes out of a packet with tiny marshmallows that never really melt. That's when we heard it. A knock at the front door. Julie and I exchanged a look. Who the hell would be out in this? I muttered, setting my mug down. When I opened the door, the wind nearly ripped it off its hinges. Snow swirled in, icy and stinging, but through the chaos, I saw him. The man was tall and thin, his face pale as bone. He wore an old-fashioned coat, the kind you'd see in Civil War photographs, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. But it was his eyes that caught me. They were pitch black, like someone had scooped out his soul and left an empty void behind. "Evening," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Sorry to bother you folks, but I seem to be lost. Might I come in and warm myself for a bit?" Every instinct I had screamed no. Something about him felt off. But Julie, always the gracious one, was already pulling me aside. "Of course," she said, smiling. "Come in, please." The man stepped inside, brushing snow off his hat. He smelled faintly of smoke, like a fire that had burned out long ago. "What brings you out on a night like this?" Julie asked, closing the door behind him. "Traveling," he said. "Business." He didn't elaborate, and we didn't press. Instead, we settled him by the fire and offered him cocoa, which he declined with a polite wave of his hand. Emily was the first to speak up. She walked right up to him, her little feet patting softly on the hardwood floor, and said, "Are you Santa?" Julie laughed nervously, but the man smiled, a thin, crooked thing that didn't quite reach his eyes. "No, little one," he said. "But I know him." Emily beamed. "Really? Oh yes," he said. "I know all the stories. Would you like to hear one?" I don't know why we let him stay as long as we did. Maybe it was the storm, the sense of isolation, or the way his voice seemed to fill the room, commanding attention. He told Emily a story not about Rudolph or the elves, but something older, darker. He spoke of a village buried in snow, where children disappeared on Christmas Eve, lured away by a figure in red who left no footprints. "It wasn't Santa, though," he said, leaning forward. The firelight cast strange shadows on his face. "It was something else. Something hungry." Emily's eyes were wide, her coloring forgotten. Julie was visibly uncomfortable, shifting in her seat, but she didn't interrupt. I think we were both frozen, unable to look away. "And what happened to the children?" Emily asked, her voice small. The man's smile widened. They became part of the story. By the time he finished, the storm had worsened. The windows rattled in their frames, and the wind sounded like a chorus of whispers. "You should stay the night," Julie said suddenly, though I could see the hesitation in her eyes. The man shook his head. "I appreciate your kindness, but I have places to be." He stood, towering over us, and for a moment, I thought he was going to leave. But then he turned to Emily. "Before I go, may I give you a gift?" Julie and I both started to protest, but Emily nodded eagerly. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a small box, wrapped in red paper and tied with a black ribbon. "Open it on Christmas morning," he said, handing it to her. "And remember, every gift has a price." He left without another word, disappearing into the storm. I don't remember sleeping that night. Something about him lingered, like a bad smell you can't quite place. Julie and I agreed to throw the box away, but when I went to get it the next morning, it was gone. "Emily, where's the box?" I asked. She looked up at me, innocent as ever. "I hid it. You said I couldn't open it till Christmas." Christmas morning came, and so did the unease. Emily woke us up early, clutching the box like it was the greatest treasure she'd ever seen. Julie and I exchanged a look, but didn't stop her. Inside was a porcelain doll, dressed in a faded green dress. Its face was cracked, its eyes glassy and lifeless. Emily loved it instantly. "Her name is Holly," she said, cradling the doll like a baby. That's when the noises started. It began with whispers, soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from the walls. Then, things started moving. Small things at first. A chair sliding an inch, a picture frame tilting on the mantel. By the time the sun set, the house felt alive. "Holly says we should go outside," Emily said at dinner, her voice unnervingly calm. "No one's going anywhere," I snapped. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hall. I found Emily by the front door, her tiny hand on the knob, the doll clutched tight to her chest. "Emily," I said, my voice shaking. "What are you doing?" "Holly says I have to go," she whispered. "He's waiting." I grabbed her and pulled her back to bed, locking the door behind us. The next morning, the storm had cleared. The roads were plowed, the world a blinding white. But Emily was gone. No footprints in the snow. No sign of a struggle. Just the doll, sitting upright in her bed, its cracked face smiling faintly. They never found her. The police chalked it up to the storm, said she must have wandered off and gotten lost. But Julie and I knew better. We moved out of Cranberry Falls that spring. Julie doesn't talk about it anymore, and I've tried to forget. But every Christmas, I hear that knock at the door. And every Christmas, I pray it doesn't come again. There's an old joke in our little Maine town that goes, if you don't like the weather, just wait 5 minutes. But on December 24th, 1987, the weather didn't change. It was bitter cold, the kind of cold that settles in your bones and doesn't leave, no matter how close you sit to the fire. I was 15 that Christmas, living with my mom in the house my grandparents built. It was just the two of us since Dad died in '85, but Mom did her best to make the holidays special. She baked cookies, hung garlands, and strung lights around our crooked little pine tree. But what I remember most from that year wasn't the smell of cinnamon or the sound of carols on the radio. It was the wreath. The wreath maker lived on the edge of town in a drafty old Victorian house that leaned like it might tip over at any moment. No one knew his real name. Folks just called him the wreath maker because every December he'd sell his handmade wreaths at the town square. They were beautiful things too. Perfect circles of evergreen adorned with pine cones, ribbons, and sprigs of holly. But they were strange too. Each wreath had something extra. One might have a scrap of faded fabric tied into a bough. Another might have a tarnished silver bell or a tiny wooden charm shaped like a bird. Unique pieces, he called them. One of a kind. Mom loved those wreaths. She said they reminded her of her childhood, when Christmas still felt magical. That year, She bought one on Christmas Eve, just before the market closed. I remember how proud she was of it. She hung it on our front door, stepping back to admire it like it was a masterpiece. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said, brushing the snow off her gloves. I didn't answer. Something about it made me uneasy. Maybe it was the little porcelain angel perched at the top, its blank eyes staring into the distance. Or maybe it was the smell earthy and damp, like the inside of an old basement. That night, the dream started. In mine, I was standing in a forest. The trees were bare, their branches clawing at the sky. The ground was covered in snow, but there were no footprints, not mine, not anyone else's. I heard a sound behind me, soft and rhythmic, like the crunch of boots on fresh snow. When I turned, I saw the wreath maker. He was holding one of his wreaths, but it wasn't made of evergreen. The branches were blackened, twisted, and dripping with something dark and sticky. "Your turn," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I woke up gasping, the taste of copper in my mouth. I didn't tell Mom about the dream. She'd been so happy that day, and I didn't want to ruin it. But things got worse. The next morning, I found the front door open. The wreath was gone. "Must have blown off in the wind," Mom said, though her voice wavered. "I'll check the yard," but it wasn't in the yard. It wasn't anywhere. By afternoon, strange things started happening. The lights on the tree flickered and died, even though the power was fine. Mom's favorite snow globe, a gift from Dad, cracked down the middle, leaking glitter and water onto the mantel. And then there were the footprints. They appeared in the snow outside, leading from the street to our front porch. Heavy, deliberate prints. But no one had knocked, and there was no sign of anyone leaving. That night, the dreams came back. This time, the forest was darker. The air was thick with the smell of burning pine, and the trees seemed to lean closer, their branches tangled like fingers. The wreath maker was there again, but he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a group of figures, men, women, children. Their faces were pale and slack, their eyes cloudy and unfocused. Each of them held a wreath, just like his. "You're late," he said, and I woke up screaming. On Christmas morning, I told Mom everything. About the dreams, the footprints, the wreath. She listened, her face pale, and for the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. "I knew him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The wreath maker. When I was a little girl, I stared at her, stunned. He wasn't called that back then," she continued. "His name was Ezra Crow. He lived in the same house, made the same wreaths. My mother bought one every year." Her hands trembled as she spoke. "One Christmas, my sister Alice disappeared. She was only 7. We searched for days, but we never found her." Tears welled in her eyes. "The next time I saw Ezra, he had a new wreath at the market. It had a bow made from Alice's favorite dress. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The porcelain angel on our wreath, it wasn't just a decoration. It was a keepsake, a piece of someone's life, stolen and repurposed. "We have to burn it," I said. "But it's gone," Mom replied, her voice shaking. "No, it's not," I said. I could feel it, like a weight pressing on my chest. It was still out there, waiting for us. We found it in the woods, hanging from a low branch like some grotesque Christmas ornament. The angel's face was cracked now, its eyes missing. The wreath itself had changed too. The branches were dry and brittle, their edges sharp as knives. I doused it in lighter fluid and set it ablaze. The flames roared to life, consuming the wreath in seconds. For a moment, I thought I heard something scream, high and piercing, like the cry of a wounded animal. Then it was gone, and the forest was silent. We left Cranberry Falls the following spring. Mom never bought another wreath. Sometimes I still dream of the wreath maker. I see him standing in that dark forest, his hands blackened and raw, weaving his terrible creations. And sometimes, late at night, I think I hear footsteps in the snow outside my window. But I don't look. I never look. I was never one for holiday cheer. Sure, I'd slap a wreath on the door and string up some lights, but Christmas always felt like a chore. It was the pressure, the gifts, the gatherings, the fall smiles. Maybe that's why I ended up at Holly Pines last December alone, with a bottle of bourbon and a stubborn refusal to answer my phone. Holly Pines wasn't much to look at anymore, not since the paper mill shut down back in the 90s. Half the houses were boarded up, and the only signs of life were the occasional plumes of chimney smoke and a broken-down Chevy parked outside the old diner. But I liked the quiet. I'd inherited the cabin from my uncle, a gruff man who'd passed away 3 years prior, and it suited me just fine. It was December 23rd when the strange things started happening. I'd been sitting by the fire, nursing my bourbon and half watching an old black and white Christmas movie on the TV. Outside, snow was falling in thick, lazy flakes, covering the skeletal branches of the pines. It should have been picturesque, but instead, there was this uneasiness in the air. I noticed it first when the firewood crackled louder than usual, a sharp pop that sent sparks skittering across the hearth. The sound made me jump, spilling bourbon on my flannel shirt. "Damn it," I muttered, blotting at the stain. That's when I heard a faint jingling sound, like tiny bells coming from outside. At first, I thought it was the wind. Holly Pines was notorious for gusts that could rattle the shutters like a poltergeist. But this was different. It was rhythmic, purposeful, like someone was walking just beyond the cabin. "Who's out there?" I called, opening the door. The cold hit me like a slap, the kind that stings even through thick wool. Snow covered the ground in an unbroken sheet, pristine, except for a set of footprints leading from the tree line. They weren't human. The prints were cloven, like a goat's, and they were fresh. I could see the edges of the indentations, sharp against the powdery snow. The jingling grew louder, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving between the trees, a shadow, tall and impossibly thin, with antlers that stretched toward the sky. I slammed the door. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I double-checked the locks and sat with my back to the wall, the bourbon doing little to calm my nerves. By morning, the footprints were gone, the snow smooth as if nothing had disturbed it. Christmas Eve came, and with it, a storm. The wind howled like a banshee, and the snow fell so heavily that it erased the world outside the window. I'd planned to drive into town for supplies, but the road was impassable. I spent most of the day trying to distract myself, but as night fell, that uneasiness crept back in. Around p.m., the power went out. I lit a few candles and stoked the fire, telling myself it was just a coincidence. Then came the knock. It wasn't a polite knock. It was a heavy, deliberate pounding that shook the door on its hinges. I froze. Who the hell would be out here in this weather? "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer, just another series of deafening knocks. Grabbing the poker from the fireplace, I crept toward the door. "If this is some kind of joke, it's not funny," I said. I opened the door. No one was there, but there was something on the porch, a small, ornate bell tied with a red ribbon. It looked old, the kind of antique you'd find in a dusty curio shop, and it was warm to the touch, as if it had just been held. I picked it up, and the moment I did, the air seemed to shift. The wind stopped, the snow ceased, and the world fell into an unnatural silence. And then, from the darkness, I heard a voice. "Ring the bell," it said. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was deep guttural and laced with malice. "Who's there?" I demanded, stepping back inside. "Ring the bell," the voice repeated, closer now. I slammed the door and locked it. The voice laughed, a low, rumbling sound that sent shivers down my spine. The hours dragged on. The storm picked up again, battering the cabin with icy gusts. I kept the bell on the table, staring at it like it might spring to life. Around midnight, I heard the jingling again. This time, it was inside. I turned to see the shadow from before, towering in the corner of the room. Its antlers scraped the ceiling, and its eyes glowed like embers. "Ring the bell," it said, holding out a hand, if you could call it that. Its fingers were long and spindly, ending in sharp claws. "What do you want?" I whispered. "Your choice," it said. "Ring the bell or I take what's mine." I didn't know what it meant, but I didn't want to find out. I grabbed the bell and rang it. The sound was deafening, a piercing chime that reverberated through the cabin. The shadow let out a roar, a mix of rage and triumph, before disappearing into the darkness. When I woke up, it was Christmas morning. The power was back, the storm had passed, and the bell was gone. I'd like to believe it was all a dream, but I can't, because every Christmas since, I've heard the jingling, and I know it's waiting.